Today, I'm responding to the video titled F4F, Joseph Prince Invents a Healing Activation Doctrine. First off, I want to commend the creator of that video for not just pulling a soundbite out of context like many critics do. They took the time to examine over 6 minutes of Joseph Prince's sermon, which is a more responsible approach than most. However, I still believe they missed some crucial points by not looking at the entire sermon. If they had, they would have seen that Joseph Prince does clarify his stances, especially regarding healing and faith. Now, I'm sure many of you have probably misunderstood Joseph Prince's teachings on healing at some point. Maybe you thought he teaches that if you're not healed, it's because you didn't have enough faith. If you've ever struggled with this or feel like he could improve how he communicates about God's sovereignty in healing, drop a comment below and let's discuss it. Do you agree that Joseph Prince should be more clear about God's role in healing? This conversation matters, so hit that like button if you think more people should be aware of the nuances in his teachings, and share this video so others can weigh in. Let's get this discussion going and make this video viral. Now, let's dive into the key points regarding Joseph Prince's teachings on healing, addressing both the critique and what the Bible says. Joseph Prince does teach that one should always believe in the vision of full total healing, because that is the will of God. Even if, in God's sovereign will, full healing does not come, he encourages believers to continue trusting. He also points out that many people fail to receive healing because they don't fully believe in the goodness and grace of God, which limits their ability to receive that grace. However, when someone genuinely seeks to receive healing but doesn't experience it, they should still be restful, knowing that God always has the best in mind for our hearts. Now, Joseph Prince does emphasize that we should avoid judging others when healing doesn't occur. Whether someone fully received grace is something only God can know. In such cases, Prince urges believers to focus on their own faith and their openness to receiving God's grace, rather than questioning the spiritual state of others. That said, while Joseph Prince acknowledges God's sovereignty in healing, there are areas in his teachings where his emphasis on faith could be clearer regarding the role of God's will. The claim that Prince teaches healing only comes through strong faith, and that a lack of healing means a lack of faith, is false. Let's break down why this critique is misleading and look at both Joseph Prince's direct sources and the Bible for context. What Joseph Prince really says about healing. Joseph Prince is often misunderstood, especially when it comes to his teachings on healing. Critics frequently claim that he promises guaranteed healing for all believers if they have enough faith. But this interpretation oversimplifies his message. Joseph Prince on healing through grace. In his book Healing Promises, Prince writes, "Jesus is still our healer today. His grace is greater than any sickness, and when you see his love and grace toward you, faith arises, and healing manifests." Here, Prince emphasizes that healing comes from God's grace, not from the believer's efforts to muster faith. Yes, faith plays a role, but it's about receiving grace rather than activating healing through personal belief. This is a crucial distinction that critics often miss. What happens when healing doesn't occur? This is where misunderstandings arise. In his sermon Does God Still Heal Today? Prince explains, there are some things we may not fully understand on this side of heaven. We know God is able to heal, and we believe for it, but sometimes we don't see the full manifestation of healing in this life. We must trust in God's sovereign will. This statement acknowledges the mystery of God's sovereignty in healing. Prince does not claim that healing always occurs based solely on the believer's faith. Instead, he teaches that sometimes healing doesn't manifest, but that doesn't mean God isn't in control or that faith has failed. Joseph Prince on Paul's thorn in the flesh. Interestingly, Joseph Prince interprets Paul's thorn in the flesh, 2 Corinthians 12:7, not as a physical ailment but as a person who was critical of Paul. Even if this interpretation differs from the traditional view, Prince's key point remains: whether the thorn was a person or an ailment, Paul's experience highlights how God's grace is sufficient in our weaknesses. It's not always about removing the trial but about trusting God's plan in the midst of it. Joseph Prince on suffering. There's a common misconception that Joseph Prince doesn't address suffering, but this isn't accurate. Prince does teach that believers should expect suffering, specifically, suffering for Christ's sake. He emphasizes that the persecution and attacks Christians face while spreading the gospel are to be expected. However, when it comes to healing, Prince encourages believers to contend for healing with faith, as seen in Isaiah 53:5, "By his stripes we are healed." Prince teaches that healing is part of the atonement and that Christians should have faith that God will heal them. But at the same time, he is clear that God's sovereignty determines when and how healing manifests. While we are to believe in healing, the ultimate outcome rests in God's hands, and we must trust that His will is always best. Biblical support for healing and faith. The Bible does indeed affirm the availability of healing through faith, but it also acknowledges that faith is not always the determining factor. Consider the following key passages: Isaiah 53:5, NIV, "By his wounds we are healed." This verse forms the basis for the belief that healing is available through Christ's sacrifice. Joseph Prince aligns with this, emphasizing that healing is part of the atonement. 2 Corinthians 12:7-9, NIV, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Here, Paul speaks about his thorn in the flesh, which God chose not to remove, despite Paul's prayers. This demonstrates that even when faith is present, God's sovereignty ultimately determines the outcome, aligning with Prince's teaching that God may allow trials for his purpose. James 5:14-15, NIV, "Is anyone among you sick? Let them call the elders of the church to pray over them. And the prayer offered in faith will make the sick person well." While this passage encourages faith-filled prayer for healing, it doesn't guarantee that healing will always occur immediately. Like Prince teaches, faith is important, but God's will is the final determinant. Misunderstanding Joseph Prince's message. The critique that Joseph Prince teaches healing is dependent solely on a person's faith is a misreading of his message. In his book Destined to Reign, Prince writes, "It is not about how much faith you can produce. It's about how much grace you can receive." Prince doesn't place the burden of healing on the believer's ability to generate faith. Rather, healing is about resting in God's grace. If healing doesn't come, it's not because someone lacked faith, but because of God's sovereign will. What the critique got right and wrong. I agree with the critique that Joseph Prince could make the sovereignty of God more explicit in his teachings. There are moments when his emphasis on faith and grace could lead to misunderstandings, particularly if listeners think healing is guaranteed. But the critique is wrong in suggesting that Prince blames a lack of healing solely on a lack of faith. He consistently teaches that faith must be paired with trust in God's will. Misunderstanding versus misleading. Where Joseph Prince could improve is in clarifying that faith is not a guarantee of healing. While his strong emphasis on grace and faith could lead some to misinterpret his message, this is not false teaching but a need for better communication. Guaranteed healing. What does the Bible say? Does the Bible promise that everyone who has faith will be healed? The short answer is no. The Bible encourages prayer for healing but recognizes that God's will plays a role. For example, Paul's instruction to Timothy in 1 Timothy 5:23 to drink a little wine for his frequent illnesses suggests that even faithful Christians experience ongoing physical challenges. The truth is that healing is part of God's grace, but it's not always experienced in the here and now. This is the balance Joseph Prince strives to convey: believe for healing, but trust that God's sovereign will is always best, even when healing doesn't manifest. Conclusion. So, does Joseph Prince teach that healing is guaranteed for every Christian if they have enough faith? No. He teaches that healing is available through God's grace, but he acknowledges that God's sovereignty ultimately determines when and how healing occurs. He does not blame a lack of healing solely on a lack of faith and encourages believers to rest in God's grace, knowing that His will is always good, even when healing doesn't come. At the end of the day, Prince's message is about resting in God's grace, trusting in His will, and believing for healing while accepting that God's purposes are sometimes beyond our understanding. If you found this helpful, like, comment, and share this video, and let's continue the conversation about grace, faith, and